This is the M2 MacBook Air, and it's the base model. That's right, the base model with 8 GB of unified memory and that now infamous 256 GB SSD. These are my first impressions, and spoiler, it has really taken me by surprise. Like many people, I've been waiting for an awfully long time to get my hands on the new MacBook Air. It's the successor to the fantastic M1 MacBook Air. Mine is now covered in stickers. I've really put this thing through its paces over the last nearly 2 years. Where are we? 2022. However long it's been, I've really battered this thing, and it's been the best laptop I've ever owned. Now that means that this one has an awful lot to live up to. Now I only got the M2 MacBook Air yesterday, so this isn't a full review, it can't be, but I can give you my first impressions of Apple's latest MacBook Air, and I can also run a quick Final Cut Pro test just to see what all the fuss is about with this 256GB SSD base model. Is the base model a dud? Is this a worthy successor to that brilliant M1 MacBook Air? Let's get into it. Before we get into it, a quick note from today's sponsor, which is NordVPN. If you're not sure what a VPN is, basically you have your computer here, you have the internet here. Normally, without a VPN, you just connect to the internet and away you go. That's fine if you're at home, but if you're in a coffee shop or some other public place where you don't know what's going on within that network, that bit in between can be a little bit dicey. Now what a VPN does is sit right in the middle and basically takes the traffic that goes from your computer to the internet backwards and forwards and makes sure no one can get into it. That's a ridiculously simplified explanation of a VPN, but it works for me. And what it means basically is I can take my now brand new M2 MacBook Air to a coffee shop, use their internet connection, and not worry about some other person in the corner of the room spying on my data. I use NordVPN all the time. It's just massive peace of mind. You can't get too excited about it, but it does really give you this peace of mind that just works away in the background and makes sure your data is protected. And when it comes to price, it's a bit of a no-brainer really. It's about the same cost as a cup of coffee, which is pretty digestible if you excuse the pun. And yeah, there's loads of VPNs out there, but I absolutely love NordVPN. I completely trust it. It's fantastic, it works, it's seamless. Go and check it out. If you use the link in my description, which is nordvpn.com/MarkEllisVPN, you'll find out more. It's risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Go and check it out. Right, we'll start with the hardware with the M2 MacBook Air. This is a completely new design, so that wedge has gone. We now have this squared off kind of MacBook Pro aesthetic, and I absolutely love it. I think the box, which you can just see behind me here, I think that says it all. It's got this kind of profile, side view of the laptop. It's thin. It's really thin. Might be a little bit too thin, potentially. That's one thing I'm slightly worried about. My concern with it is that it might have bending issues. We don't know this. It's literally just come onto the market. These things are built like tanks. There's no two ways about it. But people have bent their MacBooks in backpacks and things. It's something I worry about with the 16-inch MacBook Pro. This might be completely unfounded and completely, nothing to worry about, but it's ridiculously thin, but it does look and feel like a super tiny MacBook Pro, which I don't think is any bad thing at all. There are obviously other design changes, so we now get the full height function row keys at the top and a full-sized Touch ID key, along with things like MagSafe. And it's these smaller changes that actually make it feel like such a completely different device to the outgoing M1 MacBook Air. Now this is the Midnight version, which is basically a very dark blue, but it looks black. It's basically black, let's be honest. And it's lovely when you first get it out of the box. This is really worth bearing in mind if you're thinking about getting the Midnight version. And you've probably seen already on this video, the big issue we have here is fingerprints. As soon as you pick this thing up and start using it, this happens. And yet you can wipe them off with a decent cloth and it gets rid of them temporarily, but they do come back as soon as you start using it. I can't tell you if that's going to be a problem for you. You'll know that yourself if that's going to be an irritating thing. One thing to bear in mind is that because it is so dark, you can't always see the smudges. So in certain rooms, in certain angles, you can't spot them. In fact, it's that dark that you can't even spot the Apple logo sometimes. It's just when the light catches it at the right or the wrong angle, it just looks a bit of a mess. It's a shame because it's such a lovely colour, and I don't know what Apple could have done to make it not fingerprint smudgy, but it really is. And as I say, it's up to you. Whether or not that's going to bother you, that's your deal. But we'll see how it wears over time as well, because I do tend to throw my MacBook Airs around a little bit over time. So I'm quite a good test case for this. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe and see how this fares over the next few months. Right, onto performance, and remember, I've only had this for about a day, so it can't be considered a full soak test for this thing, but I have made some interesting discoveries already. Now, this might be a placebo effect, and it might just be because it's a brand new laptop, but it does feel very, very snappy indeed, particularly compared to the M1 MacBook Air, which is no slouch whatsoever. But if you compare the two side by side, this does open apps a little bit quicker, and I don't know, just kind of moving around macOS feels incredibly smooth. So Apple has clearly done something with the kind of base level single core performance of that M2 chip, and it does feel quicker than the M1 in that respect. But I know that all you care about at the moment is whether or not the 256GB SSD in this base model is garbage. So I ran a test with Final Cut Pro with a piece of 10-minute 4K footage from this FX3 camera. Nothing fancy, but they're not exactly light video work. It's fairly chunky stuff. And I tested it against my trusty M1 MacBook Air with two scenarios. The first was with a bunch of apps running alongside Final Cut Pro, which included Safari with some open tabs, Spark Email, Ulysses, Discord, Lightroom, and a bunch of others. This for me is a completely normal workflow. I tend to leave all of that stuff open while I'm exporting videos. Now, in my test, the M1 MacBook Air, with the exact same list of apps open, completed that export of 4K footage from Final Cut Pro in 5 minutes, 12 seconds, and it felt completely usable while it was doing it. The M2 MacBook Air, on the other hand, took 5 minutes 41 seconds, which is nearly 30 seconds slower than the older model. However, it did feel completely usable during that export. So just like the M1, the M2 felt fine multitasking while exporting 4K footage from Final Cut Pro. I then ran the exact same test, the exact same export with the exact same piece of footage with just Final Cut Pro open on both laptops. And during that export, the M1 MacBook Air export time barely changed. In fact, it only went down by 1 second to 5 minutes and 11 seconds. The M2, on the other hand, did decrease its export time with just Final Cut Pro open, but it went down to 5 minutes 12 seconds, which is basically on a par with the M1 rather than beating it. But I wanted to go further than this with a different version of the M2, so I called in my friend Pete Matheson. I'll leave a link to his first impressions video in the description. He's got an M2 MacBook Air with the 512GB SSD and 8GB of unified memory. He ran the exact same tests with the exact same piece of footage, and with his laptop, with apps open, it took 5 minutes and 18 seconds. When he closed all of those apps apart from Final Cut Pro, the export time came down to 5 minutes, 12 seconds. So if you take Pete and my tests at face value, the 512GB SSD only shaves 23 seconds off a 4K export over the 256GB version. If you're multitasking, if you're just running Final Cut Pro on its own, the performance between the 256GB and the 512GB version of the M2 is identical. Firstly, it means that you can never take one test or one benchmark at face value. There's just so many factors involved. It's why proper benchmarking is an absolute art. I'm not any good at it, I can't do it, because you have to cover every single scenario. Despite this, from my testing and from Pete's testing, the speed deficiency is only evident in those Final Cut Pro export times. Both laptops felt perfectly usable during that process. And that's what I was worried about. I was worried that the base model M2 MacBook Air would be terrible when multitasking when you're doing things like video editing. But this has been my point during this entire M2 saga. I'll leave a link above to my interview with Max Tech, which I think is very revealing from both our points of view. But the people who buy the M2 MacBook Air are never going to notice those slower export times or throttling. They're just not watching the clock in the same way that a MacBook Pro user might be watching the clock if they're working on a client-driven project. Equally, they're not sitting there with an M1 and an M2 MacBook Air running these kinds of tests. That isn't normal behavior. Only us YouTubers do this. How do I feel about it all? Honestly, I think these kind of tests that us YouTubers do cause mass hysteria amongst the people who are waiting for Apple to trip up. But the problem is that they also cast this kind of pointless shadow over the vast majority of people who will buy this laptop and absolutely love it. Apple has definitely given us less when it comes to the SSD performance in these M2 base model MacBooks. I'm not disputing that at all. And I think Max Tech's work is vitally important in raising awareness of it. It's letting Apple know that this has been noted and that it is naughty. They've also given us this brand new beautiful chassis, a better screen, MagSafe, and all of the kudos that comes from having the new Apple thing, which, like it or not, means far more to a lot of people than NAND chips and marginal differences between Final Cut Pro export times. Remember, no one knew or cared what a NAND chip was a few weeks ago, and now it's all over the news. Put it this way, if I made this video again but without that test, I'm pretty sure I'd come to the same conclusion that this laptop is still a great buy. The M2 speed controversy does have substance, and it is an important debate that needs to continue in an adult fashion. But when you get your hands on one of these things, it doesn't really matter. And I know that won't be a popular opinion among some people who watch these videos, but if you're that fussed about what's going on beneath the hood of these things, buy yourself a MacBook Pro. Apple is always going to cut corners with these kind of things where it can, and you can bet your bottom dollar that they're not losing sleep over this M2 stuff at all. Regardless, I'm going to spend a lot more time with this thing over the next few weeks and months. It's going to be my main workhorse for this business. So make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, and you will not miss any future videos about the M2 MacBook Air. If you're still in the process of choosing your own M2 MacBook Air, don't worry, I've got you covered. Keep watching for a link to a playlist where I've put all of my M2 MacBook Air content, including that brilliant interview with Max Tech.